Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I am your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend, co-host, and colleague, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, my head is still spinning. It has been a whirlwind of a couple of weeks here, not even a couple of weeks. It's felt almost like a couple of months. So many things have happened. Just a quick bullet point list here of what's taken place. And I want to get your initial reaction to some of this. We had the Christopher Mellon article in Politica that was really, I think, the furthest that we've seen Mellon go in his public writings, talking about the people that have confided in him, the people that he has referred to Congress about crash retrieval programs. That was a pretty big and bold type of piece there. And that was just kind of the prelude to, of course, what everyone has been talking about in our circles, the David Grush article that came out in The Debrief, written by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. That was followed up by the David Grush interview on News Nation from Roz Coulthart, several interview segments there, and a full-length segment that aired on Sunday night. On top of that, we had the National Press Club event with Stephen Greer. That was several hours long, many different whistleblower testimonies and witness testimonies that were submitted, some very compelling stories there from him. And then, of course, the reactions to all of the above. We've had the social media reaction, we've had the mainstream media reaction, the skeptical reaction, and then, lest we forget, there was one other event we're going to talk about as well. That was this bizarre potential encounter that happened in Las Vegas with, reported sightings of beings in someone's backyard. I mean, Darren, like, if you were to rewind 10 years ago, you would want, like, one of these kinds of events would be, like, would have made the entire year in ufology. But to have all of these things happen essentially back to back over the course of several days, it is, I don't even know if we fully digested. I don't know if we fully, wrapped our minds around what has just taken place. But, what are your initial thoughts to that quick summary? And, how you been? You getting good sleep with all this? It's just a lot going on, man.
There is indeed. I mean, yeah, if you were writing a book or writing a story, you would at least spread it out over 6 months, because it just would not be believable that much would happen in the space of a week and a half or whatever it's been. Unprecedented, right? I mean, it's shocking and remarkable. And of course, there's all the details to get into in terms of how much this has moved the proverbial needle in the big picture. These are three very different kinds of events between the Las Vegas reported sighting, we should say, alleged, the Greer event, and of course, the Debrief article mixed with the Roz Coulthart interview of Grush. I mean, absolutely bonkers in a way. In many ways, it's the week that many in ufology have been hoping for their entire lives. And undoubtedly, I've seen people that have been in this for decades, much longer than you and I have been, who said they can hardly believe how much has happened, and they have been waiting for someone like David Grush to come out and say these things. What's interesting for those of us intimately familiar with the topic is that many of the revelations he brought forward are things we've heard, right? This has been in the grapevine, so to speak. What's different is he's saying this publicly, and he's saying this as a very credible, highly ranking intelligence officer with information from numerous agencies, someone who worked on the UAP task force and indeed helped draft the legislation to do with whistleblowers coming forward. So what a week, indeed. Are you sleeping?
Well, I got to admit, the first couple of days there, I wasn't sleeping very well. And I don't know that it had anything to do with these things, but perhaps it did. Sleeping a lot better now after I've had a chance to kind of sit with a lot of these revelations. It's just so much content, and it's so dense. And like you said, a lot of the things that were revealed in the David Grush pieces there were things that, if you've been studying this topic for a while, we already essentially knew or believed were the case. So a degree of validation there, at least for those who are already following this. Now, I can already hear them talking, it just sounds like he got a hold of the ufology Kool-Aid, and he had a big old gulp of it, and he just regurgitated everything that these fanatics have essentially fed him, over time. And, I want to get into some of that as we unpack what he talked about, because I think that's, I got lump that into the disingenuous critique of what we've had happen here. Uh, David Grush is as credible a witness as you could hope for. Somebody who has been within the establishment, a long career, highly decorated, constantly promoted, not just promoted in, kind of the same type of role, but elevated into other more sensitive roles progressively throughout his career, trusted with some of our country's most sensitive secrets. To then sort of say that this person had just been hoodwinked by a couple of folks that are into sci-fi and fantasy stories, I think would in and of itself be a incredibly shocking and terrifying and troubling revelation there. For a guy like this to be easily duped, man, we've got some bigger problems at work here. If that really is true, and I don't think that it is.
Indeed. In fact, he mentioned on the Coulthard interview that he was very methodical, very cautious about believing these revelations. He took years actually corroborating them for himself so that he felt like he could really be confident about this. And let's be honest about this. These naysayers who that is their critique, it's ridiculous because this is career suicide in many ways, right? The only reason someone like this comes forward is either they're not a credible witness, and for the very reasons you just pointed out, he very much is a credible witness. The only reason they would do it is if they become so convinced that it's in the public good that they are willing to make a massive sacrifice to come forward and do this. And that's the way that I read this. I don't know how you read it any other way.
Yes, well, the one alternate way is that folks will say, aha, here we have another attempt on behalf of the secret keepers to, kind of have us chase down this rabbit hole and control the narrative. He's all a part of the disinfo campaign. No one can be trusted. The government can't be trusted ever. So that's certainly the other, storyline here that we hear bantered about. I'm incredibly frustrated by that, and I think that it does point to me. It highlights the damage that the lack of government transparency has inflicted upon the public over so many decades, not just with this topic, but so many other areas where we feel as if the government hasn't been straight with the American people or the people of the world. We know governments keep secrets, and there are many instances and examples where governments have kept secrets. Those secrets have later been exposed, and people who tried to expose them back when the events were taking place were ridiculed and marginalized, and later on they're vindicated, but later on it's almost too late. So we've suffered particularly heavily in this community, the community of interest in ufology here, from this kind of effect. And I understand we have a right to be reflexively skeptical about what might be taking place here. And at the same time, I do think we've had so many different folks come forward from within programs who aren't connected to each other explicitly over the course of many, many years, decades even, who've come forward that to say this is just one grand conspiracy, where all of these individuals are a part of, I think is a bridge too far. So I'm frustrated by that. I get it. It bothers me as well. But I think we have an opportunity here, maybe a unique one, particularly with this subject, to be straight with the people of America and the world, about what really took place, and then restore credibility that has been lost. I think there's a great option, to kind of take this forward and enhance that kind of trust that is so desperately needed.
Absolutely true. And I think when I reflect on not just the news, but how the news has been received, that has been as interesting as the news itself almost, when you think about the sociological equation here. Because on the one hand, it's almost like the government has done its job so well that now people jump into the PSYOP category, even when it's not a PSYOP. So if you really want to confuse people to the point where they basically lose interest, they're exhausted from even trying to pry apart the truth from the falsehood, the wheat from the chaff. They've done that so much historically, and even he spoke to this, Grush spoke to this, that there's been information that's been leaked over time, but it's mixed with disinformation, so much so that people just don't know what to make of it, and they just basically give up, or it gets put into conspiracy theory kind of territory. So that's what I've noticed, is that some people jump right to PSYOP right away, which is interesting because, again, this is someone who's coming forward to say, I'm here to expose the very groups that brought about the PSYOPs, and then he gets accused of being part of a PSYOP. So even people who are interested in this topic, I'm seeing them say, I don't believe any of it, right? It's another PSYOP, which if you're Grush, you must be shaking your head thinking, what? Here I am, the one trying to tattletale on this endeavor that goes back historically. He's talked about those very things. Now, of course, the people convinced of that narrative will say, well, of course he's going to say that because that's even more convincing. He makes PSYOPs part of the PSYOP. It's the ultimate PSYOP, right? So this speaks to, like what you're saying, the lack of trust in our government and our, not just our government, but our media structures. We're going to get into that, how authority is looked at. And so people feel most empowered, ironically, by just saying, I don't believe it. No matter what it is, they just feel more comfortable saying that, unless it comes from their buddy down the street, or their poker club that gets together and someone says, hey, did you hear this? They're more likely to believe that than they are to believe anything coming from governmental structures or official legacy media, which again just is ironic when you consider the fact that what Grush is trying to do here. You also get, like you said, people who claim really, really strangely that all Grush is doing is basically regurgitating a mashup of all these popular ufology memes, as if that's the answer, as if it's not obvious to everyone else that that's the case. But of course, the logical answer to me seems to be, well, because there was always a there. And so these things that have been rumored, that have been leaked out, again, in the midst of other disinformation, but there's been truth nuggets that have come out. And that's why this feels strangely familiar. And yet some people want to jump in and say, well, it's just a regurgitation of myth, basically. This speaks to how much of a challenge this is, how much of a hill we have to climb here, because it's not just about truth. I made this point on Point of Convergence last week. It's not just about truth. It's about what is palatable, what can pass to gatekeepers, both the media gatekeepers, the government gatekeepers, and even the gatekeeping in people's minds, in the general public. This is what we're up against. And I think all of us in this field recognize after a week like this, just how daunting that task is. Because if you don't see massive movement of the needle after a week like this, what is it going to take?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I know we're going to touch on that during this show. Well, let's unpack some of the things that were discussed in Grush's, but both the article from the debrief as well as those interviews with Ross Coulthart. Chief among them is that the government has been a part of a very sophisticated crash retrieval program spanning many, many years and decades, retrieving non-human technical craft, I think, or technical vehicles for the particular language that he would use. And not only that, but there were revelations about of course, beings that were recovered as part of some of these events, because some of these technical vehicles were crashed and had pilots, presumably dead pilots, possibly alive pilots, though I don't think living pilots or living beings were discussed, although perhaps implied. And then in addition to that, we had instances of malevolent activity hinted at by at least some of the beings, or at least one incident with the beings. There's a secret Cold War going on between the U.S. and its adversaries, trying to reverse engineer these craft, because we aren't the only ones who've received these things. Let's see, what else should I hit on here? That there's been such a degree of cover-up as well that human beings have done bad things to other human beings. And it sounded as if people had been killed in service of keeping all of this secret. So quite a lot there to go through. I don't know where you want to begin. Maybe we could also touch on, as we start off here, with the initial challenge of just getting this article placed into the media to begin with? Because we know that the debrief was not the first option for this piece.
Indeed, that's true. Yeah, let's break this down a little bit. So, as I mentioned on Point of Convergence, Grush was very strategic, wise, very careful, cautious, premeditated even in how he went about this, because he's someone who understands the system, right? He understands it really, really well. He knows that it's set up to keep secret for the sake of national security. But he also recognizes that if there's a legitimate bit of information or tranche of information that really is in the best interest of the public to know, he recognizes that some of those same safeguards make it almost impossible to get it out. So he was confronted with a unique situation, a challenge. But he also was in a unique opportunity of being able to be a part of the drafting of the legislation to do with the whistleblower testimony. So remember this, historically, he's drafting part of that legislation while he's also seeing these revelations, while he's also seeing that even official groups like Arrow are not going to have access to some of the information he's come across. And so that means they will likely not come to the conclusion they might have otherwise, which raises interesting secondary questions around, was Arrow ever really designed to really get to the bottom of this? That's another something we can get into. But so basically what happens is he's aware of all these things. All these people are coming forward who worked in the programs, people that respect him, trust him, maybe have a bit of a guilty conscience, the sense that they also recognize this needs to come out. He talked about this point that there are people on the inside, tens, he even said maybe even hundreds of people who want this out. They recognize it's in the public interest to get this out. This is not actually a threat to national security, much of this. And so they came to him, they told him these stories. They also, to be very clear, because some people want to just dismiss it on that, well, it's just stories. No, he also saw documents, he saw photos, he saw much of the evidence. Of course, he can't bring that forward to the public. He can't hand that to Ross Coulthart to put on the monitor, because that would be violating his NDA. That would be bringing classified material to the public, which would put him in jail. He cannot do that. What he can do is testify about those details, specific details here, not just the things we know about publicly, but the details about what he saw in terms of the actual evidence. He can provide that to people who do have security clearances, that have the appropriate security clearances to have that. And indeed, he has already done that. That's one of the real revelations that came out, is he's testified on all these matters. It's not like the Ross Coulthart interview was the first time he'd actually spoken about these things, or even with Blumenthal and Kane. So it's remarkable. And then when it came to actually bringing to the public this civilization shaking kind of revelations, you'd think everybody in the media would be lining up to say, we'll take it. So, of course, what did Blumenthal and Kane do? They aimed first for the highest, the most credible, the most well-known news organization in the world, the New York Times, the pinnacle of media. And they turned it down. They just flatly refused an early draft of the article, which, as I said on POC, speaks to how there's been an editorial turnover since they published the article in 2017 that really launched the most modern version of the UFO phenomenon era. But because of that turnover, they just rejected it. So they then went to some other major outlets, one of them being the Washington Post, who supposedly were interested, but they were spending so long in corroborating, in trying to find additional sourcing for the information, that kind of eventually led them to decide to just go with a secondary and less known publication in the debrief. By the way, Politico and The Hill also turned it down. They also had options on this before they went to the debrief. But as I mentioned on POC, and as has come out since then, because Grush's name had already leaked into the public, he'd already been experiencing threats, as we found from Ross Coulthart. Coulthart's suggesting that there has been even people who have broken into Grush's home. Ross went as far as to say he believes it might have been one of the defense contractors. So we're hearing sort of insinuations of goons hired by defense contractors who are being named, or at least pointed towards, in these revelations. And so this was happening. And so Kane and Blumenthal felt like they had to get the information out now. And so that's why they went with the debrief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, if you're on the receiving end of those kinds of threats, and if those things are escalating, coming forward and being public, that's a great way or a better way to protect yourself. And so I totally understand why Leslie and Ralph felt the urgency to move this forward, any means necessary. And of course, it was a coordinated effort. It wasn't just that debrief piece. It was the interview that Ross had done as well. So it was a complete, almost served up on a silver platter, quite frankly, for the world to consume and to dig into, an invitation to further investigate these amazing claims. And you can't help but just be frustrated by the whole thing, because I mean the claims are not only are they incredible, but the degree, as you said, to which he presented all this information to the proper authorities, and that we've gotten really kind of crickets from the large mainstream media outlets as far as follow-up questions to these recipients. Well, did you receive this information, and can you speak to the existence of this complaint, et cetera, et cetera. Just further corroboration of the story. And let's not forget as well, there were other corroborating elements in the piece itself from colleagues who were quoted in the debrief article. There were folks who had known Grush during his career who commented publicly on social media. Also, other ranking officials there. And then I want to applaud the debrief in this regard. They published a 3-part Q&A with Tim McMillan and Christopher Plain, going through in depth like how Tim and his team at the debrief vetted these claims, or at least vetted Grush's background, and had corroborating evidence that they were indeed legitimate. And so, you've got all of this stuff that is there, and the lack of traction is, I think, I don't know, it's incredibly frustrating. I will say this, the truth will find a way. It'll find its way out. And the fact that we now know that so many different people have received this information through official channels, they now have been exposed to this. It's one of those things that once you've been exposed to it, you can't let it go, at least not very easily, and it will spread. And I believe that it is. And of course, we've even heard instances and hints that folks who work within these specific programs have also provided corroborating evidence in support of Grush's claims. So that tells me they're willing, at least in some regard, some capacity, to come forward when the time is right as well.
Absolutely. Agreed. I think one startling eventuality that we need to look at here, with all that you just said there, we've stated in terms of making the case for how strong this evidence is, how credible the witness is, that it has not moved the needle like we were thinking. So let's backtrack a bit to when the article came out in the debrief. Sent shockwaves that Monday morning, right? I knew it was coming when I saw it begin to make the waves, and it's like people are waking up, getting their coffee and going, what's happened? And then you begin to see it spread throughout UFO Twitter and social media. It begins to be republished, sort of summarized and republished amongst some other secondary papers and news outlets. We're waiting to see it get picked up en masse. That never really happened. We saw probably the most major in the US was groups like Fox News. But as we can get into later, it's interesting how conservative media, right-leaning media, is more apt to report on these things than left-leaning media. And we can get into that because I think that's an important part of the public American conversation anyway. In Europe, actually, it got more traction. You had papers in Paris that put it on the front page above the fold. Someone actually showed a photo of going to a newsstand, and there's Dave Grush in large form, major feature right on the front page. In Paris, you had The Guardian in the UK that published this, so they were one of the biggest ones that sort of picked up and ran with the story. And then you have America. We're champions of freedom, and yet it doesn't hardly make its way into legacy media at all. We can talk later on about how even an event like the Las Vegas incident, which has a lot less backing in terms of credibility and support, that made traction that this one didn't, which raises really interesting questions of what's really going on here. What is it going to take? Again, this is the question I raise, is not just what is the nature of these revelations and what does this say about the nature of what's been happening, not just 20th century history and how that gets rewritten by this, but what is the nature of the stranglehold in our culture right now that prevents this from really taking hold and breaking through a threshold and being reckoned with. What is it? It's a shocking series of events in some ways, because you began the week with so much optimism, believing that here we go. This is what people have been talking about. The summer of 2023 was going to be lit. And it certainly seems that way. And I know some of the people involved in preparing for this. And yet once it sort of started rolling, you get that nervous feeling like, the snowball is not quite gathering the steam we were hoping for. And now we're at a point where there's a real question here. I even heard Michael Schellenberger, who actually wrote a really great piece, further corroborates what Grush has said. And this is someone who's an objective, sort of neutral media person who did exactly the job that the mainstream media should have done. And he came to some startling revelations that Grush certainly seems credible to him, and that there was people in high positions that were willing to support what he said. But, again, he's the exception to the rule. And he is an independent investigative journalist, kind of like in the light of sort of Ross Coulthart kind of thing. Why is there such a stranglehold? Is it that the DOD has such a pulse on mainstream media that basically legacy media is in the pocket of the DOD? I don't think it's quite that simple. I think they do have influence. There's something in the mainstream media itself that seems unable or unwilling, but it's almost unable is the better word, to bring this up. What is it? Is it some sort of mass apathy? Is it some sort of, who knows what's going on? But I think it's really interesting to think about the implications, because again, if we don't see this move the needle significantly, and we can still talk about whether that will happen, because there have been, like you say, political situations since then arise that suggest this will at least get additional hearings. If we have any politicians that are willing to really champion truth, then surely these revelations will take us there. But what do you think about when you think about the nature of the revelations and then the response since then?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, as you said, there's not necessarily some nefarious DOD string pulling here that prevents these outlets from covering the story. And I think I tweeted this in social media, that the official narrative about reality right now is gatekeeper enough. That I don't think we understand the degree to which we're holding on to a current paradigm about the world. And particularly when it comes to the mainstream media, which has a long legacy of, sort of left, I think that people would rightly argue, left-leaning kinds of stories, things that are highly rational or purport to be highly rational. It's very cerebral, media in and of itself, at least when it comes to print media. And so you have a legacy here of that has accumulated over time, this almost like a shell that is impervious to narratives that are not within the official domain of the world. And so if it's not about Trump, or if it's not about the economy, or if it's not about some other social policy of some kind, it's just not going to get the kind of coverage that you think it would. And that's why we've seen, as you pointed out earlier, the more right-leaning outlets and right-leaning pundits come forward in support of this story, to the frustration of those of us who might lean more to the left, because I think the left has a kind of a bias here, just to put it bluntly, a bias toward this story. They don't want to be seen as the tinfoil hat kooks, and whereas the right has in many ways already taken a stand against the media for forever. I mean, since I was a child, I grew up, hearing about, how the right just hated the media and the Clinton News Network. I mean, I just remember hearing about that. So this has been ingrained in the thoughts of the right-leaning, political spectrum. And so that they're already in some ways kind of inoculated to the official sort of storyline here, whatever it may be. And there are times when I get frustrated with that. It's sort of like, can't we have a discussion about the facts, right? What happens to be true? But you and I both know that the facts, as they are presented to the world, are often not as clear as they appear. although we like to be able to cite them, right? I think on the left, we tend to want to go, well, I read this piece in the Atlantic and I read this piece in the New York Times, and here's the facts that I can quote to you about that. And it becomes this sort of, it's my ammunition for why I am right and you are wrong. And the right here, I think rightly so in this instance, is just a little bit more willing to say, I'm not so sure about that. And they are, I think the tip of the spear here when it comes to making some progress in at least in media circles or counter media with this particular story. But I would argue we're going to cross the threshold. Eventually, this will break, and it will be something that cannot be ignored any longer. And given the range that it already has achieved, I don't see that it's going to be too much longer before that will happen.
Yeah, I think that's most of my perspective too, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I want to parse out what you just sort of hinted at there in terms of the situation in American media and American culture in general between the left and the right. Now, of course, those are speaking in broad generalities. Many people would consider themselves purple, somewhere in between. But the way that things have been marginalized and pushed to the extremes, both politically and in terms of cultural narratives, that's what we really see. And I think to many of our friends north of the border and in Europe that are listening to us might be completely perplexed by what they see. And it might be almost nonsensical when they look at the situation. So let's just make this clear. So basically on the right, you already have a built-in distrust of government. On the right, many people believe the solution is to basically dismantle government to make it as small as possible. Many people on the right, as you hinted at, believe that media is in lockstep with the left-leaning government that wants to just continually grow and take away freedom from the people. So when a story like this comes out, you actually get people on the right politically willing to talk about it. Why? It's not just because they're the brave ones. It's because it fits with their narrative. That's already their narrative, that you can't trust government, that secrets are everywhere. This is why we need to dismantle it. And so this becomes fuel for their narrative. So of course they're going to want to act on this. I'm not saying there isn't some actual desire to do the right thing, but it very much fits with their pre-existing view of the world, and especially of America today. On the left, you have a very different situation. You have this belief that most of the problems in our culture are systemic issues, and if we just keep changing the system, we'll fix all our problems, and we can ultimately trust those systemic kind of alterations that we need to make as we grow and become a more just society and a more equal society. So for those people, this is a bridge much too far. This is like Europe, from America. There's no bridge that goes across. Because if this is true, then it's not just this one area that is impacted. It's your entire worldview. It's your entire view of your country, of your nation's history, of your belief in liberty and the American way as you understand it, right? So this is why this is so difficult to really make waves and be treated in a bipartisan manner, because there's such different narratives right now about the history of our nation, of the current situation in the nation. And so actually this story, as groundbreaking as it is, how it transcends Americana, it becomes the issue of all time, right? The topic that should be garnering the interest of every human being across the planet. Instead, it sort of gets released into this American machine that wants to fit it into one of these narratives. That's kind of what happens. And because even today, as much as there is so much that's dysfunctional about America, feels like we're every week slipping closer and closer to civil war because of those polarized different views about the nature of reality itself, basically. But we're also in a situation where America has incredible influence around the world. We know, as you pointed out earlier, there are other nations who've had these crash retrievals. It's not just why has America stayed silent, why have all the other states silent too? Now, of course, part of it's because, as Gresh talked about, there's been this new Cold War. There's been this race to who can re-engineer this technology first and thus achieve geospatial and geopolitical dominance. But it also speaks to the fact that because of America's power in the world really being the only superpower for a long time, they're able to wield immense pressure to prevent these other countries from speaking up. So we think back to what happened in Brazil, cases where suddenly American troops are in within hours, right, of something being reported in terms of a crash UFO in a completely supposedly sovereign nation in a different continent. That shows how much influence America wields here around the world. This is the situation we're in. But like you say, as much as those are difficult odds to bet against, this story is just so well supported ultimately. And we are in a different era than we were in the 20th century, where different intelligence organizations could try to control a few newspapers around the world. We're in a very different media environment with social media, with things that go viral, where everybody has a cell phone and can both send information and take photos and videos of things. We can get into the Las Vegas thing because of that. But in this era, that defense is crumbling in terms of the secret keepers. And I think even the secret keepers themselves recognize, even the ones that would like to keep this secret, that this is basically a lost war already. This is a foregone conclusion. Like you're pointing at, it's going to take longer than those of us in this field would like to be the case. But inevitably, I think already the dominoes have dropped that need to drop, that there's enough awareness of this, that if this doesn't become well recognized and accounted for and legislated around in our government circles and in our culture, then we truly are an Orwellian kind of nightmare, because all the signs are there that this is really going to happen.
Yeah, totally agree. Be patient and be supportive. I think we are on the right track here. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. This is not going away. And that's one thing that I want to reemphasize, is that for the last several years, there have been so many people who have said, this will be it. This is the end of the UFO thing. It's done. Stick a fork in it. And it's not. And it keeps moving forward. And more credible people are coming forward. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see here. So keep your eyes peeled and amplify the stories that are out there that have the greatest degree of veracity. Now, a story that got a lot of media attention, even in some of these mainstream media outlets that didn't necessarily pick up the story about David Grush, was this Las Vegas, backyard alien, experience. What a weird coincidence that this happened at the same time as the Grush story. I don't want to imply necessarily anything, untoward there, but it is pretty strange that a story like that got a lot of oxygen at the same time as this very official complaint. The evidence for this Las Vegas incident isn't particularly amazing. We have a 911 call. We have a response from local police. We, of course, have a meteor in the sky that preceded the event. So this kind of perfect storm of things that occurred, along with the always present shaky cam footage. You got to have the shaky cam footage that I have seen so many filters applied to, and slow-mos and enhances, and CSI enhance. And it's really hard for me to make out anything in that backyard. So I don't know. I'm frustrated by that. Why do you think that story got so much attention versus this incredible story from David Grush?
Great question. And to highlight what Nathan's speaking to here, news outlets like CNN did cover the Las Vegas sighting. They did not really cover the Grush testimony. How does that happen? What is it about our psychological nature and the sociological equation that would let that happen? And I think we need to speak to this. It's not just CNN. It's not just the legacy media that make these decisions. There's something about this unconscious, collective, subconscious kind of persuasion that's involved here. I think what I want to say really quickly about that is that the implications of Grush's testimony are immense, not just because it suggests that the government keeps secrets, civilization-changing secrets to itself, and even tries to weaponize information around that, when it actually could be used for good and bring about technologies that could give free energy to the world, begin to transform our relationship with the planet, all these kinds of things. You've got that going on. That's a big pill for people to swallow, especially, again, people on the left who tend to trust the system for the most part. Then there's also the question of us not being the apex species. There's that aspect too, and I think we really shouldn't underestimate how much of a sway this has here, because this is a largely unconscious, knee-jerk kind of response where it's one thing to think the history of your government is not what you would hope it to be. It's another thing to think that your very origin as a species, your destiny as a species, your place on the pyramid is completely different than everything you've ever believed and what every other basically human being in the face of the planet has ever believed. These are revelations that are so shocking and they run so deep that for many people, again, I think unconsciously, they just pass on it. And I think even journalists sometimes, because they're human beings, right? They want to be objective, just like scientists. We've seen so many scientists and academics not give this subject the same fair treatment that they give other subjects. We have experiencer testimony en masse in other fields that would be considered a data set because it's not one or two, it's many, many people with diverse backgrounds that don't know each other reporting remarkably similar things. But it doesn't get treated with the same fairness. It's not held to the same standard as other kinds of testimony or other witness accounts in other kinds of inquiries. The same way here, I think, yes, we have journalists basically deciding on their own, I'm just not going to publish this. They can come up with all sorts of reasons they can rationalize. We've talked before, I think on this show, I've definitely talked about how there's evidence that when we make decisions as individuals, we think we're making rational decisions for which we can point to justifications. But when actual studies have been done by people like Dean Radin, they found that actually we make a gut instinct decision, and then a split second later, it arrives in our cognitive apparatus, and we come up with justifications to support the gut instinct that we've already come to. I think something similar happens here. People convince themselves, politicians, journalists convince themselves that they have logical reasons, rational reasons for refusing these stories. And yet I think a lot of it can be boiled down to this deep-seated fear, this instinctual, almost like existential fear of what this implies about our place in the universe. And rather than having open arms and embracing it like a mystery, like I think people like you and I do, many people go, that's a bridge too far for my own sense of self and my history and the ramifications for what it means for humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Las Vegas story is, if you look at it, it's very entertaining, right? It's got this kind of found footage quality to it. So it's very titillating and entertaining and easier for us to just be along for the journey there. Oh, this is fun, and it's an alien, and oh, we've got this 911 call, and
I hear Mulder and Scully are on the case.
Absolutely, right? So you can see that the quality of that story, it fits into that bucket, the bucket of entertainment value. Whereas the Grush story, it's literally like a gateway to insanity for many people, right? So if you take the claims of Grush seriously, you can kind of peer over the fence there at what lies beyond that and go, I don't know if I'm ready for all of the things that follow by taking this seriously. It's being discussed very seriously. So it's easier for you to look at that and kind of just say, you know what, keep on moving. I don't want to go down that alley. I'd rather stay on the main street where I can see. I've been down this path many times. It's well lit. I don't have to explore what's down there because it reveals something about the world that I am not ready for, that I fear. And I think that is a very real and rational fear that most people have. It also speaks to the long stigma that has been maintained around this topic for, quite frankly, generations. And as Grush himself pointed out, there has been a very sophisticated disinformation campaign against the American people. Unethical is the phrase that he used. So imagine what we're talking about there. If anyone ever watched the movie about Edward Snowden, or you're familiar with the Snowden story, that is an example of unethical overreach of American intelligence into the lives of private citizens. So if we're talking about things like that, but to an even greater degree, which I think you would agree we certainly are, it's a very scary place to go, and there's a lot to unravel there, and a lot of people have to answer for some pretty terrible behavior.
Absolutely, I think he said unethical and immoral. It's both.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point there, he actually spoke to it. He said he didn't just leave it to people to perhaps surmise that there's been some sort of disinformation campaign, but he named it. He said there has been a very coordinated, sophisticated, ongoing disinformation campaign against the very citizenry who elect these people. Remember, we elect these people, not the other way around. They work for us. Even if they're not elected, if they're just appointed or whatever, they work for us ultimately. Something has gone wrong in our system. We think back to what Eisenhower said on the way out, the military-industrial complex, the power players, the true power players that exist beyond the surface infrastructure that we get to have a say in terms of casting ballots. That's the part that I think is concerning for many of us, because when you think about the military-industrial complex having so much sway, and not only does it use our taxpayer dollars to create these weapons of mass destruction, but perhaps has been aware of and working around non-human technology of an incredibly sophisticated nature that allows them to who knows what in terms of what they can then manipulate. And so this raises some really, really troubling questions. This is not the kind of thing that you get together and say, okay, time to right the ship, and 2 weeks later, you're back to where you should be. It's not that kind of thing. We're talking about a decades-long, sophisticated manipulation of the entire system to the point where the entire system almost seems like a farce. This raises real questions about, do we live under democratic conditions or not? And as I said to you before we went on the air, when you have the media being as apathetic as they are and so easily controlled as they are, what hope do we have as a republic? You really have to ask these questions. And as I said before we got on the air, the founding fathers recognized that if you don't have a media that can hold feet to the fire, eventually just corrupt human nature will win the day. We might not call it royalty like they did in Europe, but we're still going to end up with a similar situation. So it really, really, even for those of us interested in this topic, poses some really daunting questions. And this is, again, where I keep saying this really ultimately speaks to the fact that we need an entire rewrite of our civilization. Because one of the things I brought up on POC that relates to something Grush said was that the situation is we've got a new Cold War where we've got nation states around the world rushing to be the first ones to develop this technology. And as I pointed out on POC, I've heard concerns amongst experiencers that they've been warned that these are not just space travel vehicles, but time travel vehicles. All the evidence suggests this is the case. So with that being the case, we're not just having your 5-year-old going and messing with your iPhone. We've got human beings rushing, perhaps carelessly, to try to get these things to work, not knowing really what is involved. And I've heard that there's concerns, there's actually could be collapse of local space-time, which directly impacts our experience of the past, the present, and the future. So rather than us getting together and saying, let's have a big global tribal conversation about what this means, let's take a moment to think about the ramifications of the fact that we're not alone. In fact, perhaps life is teeming all around us and we've had much too narrow a model just to have room for it. Let's invite new scientific inquiry to understand this broader dimensions of reality. But on top of that, we've got questions about technology that could transform civilization, that could really help us deal with things like climate change, could help us deal with many of the inequalities in the world. You hear testimony about even cures for various diseases that have been brought forward that have also been suppressed. Again, allegedly, admittedly, I'm going to say allegedly there. But when you hear about all these other things that are being confirmed by someone like David Grush, as credible as he is, you think about some of the other things that have been leaked out over time. Is that disinformation, or is that actually credible? That there's actually been cures that have been offered to us that have been, again, kept under wraps so that it can fuel the capitalist system in terms of pharmaceuticals and bankrolling these old players. These are some really challenging questions. It's depressing a little bit to think about it, but I hope that what we do is we take that and it becomes motivation. It becomes a generative kind of motivation to recognize how much we must change. Surface and superficial changes will not be sufficient here. I think Russia's claims make this clear. Once we really sit down with the gravity of these revelations, these accusations, and recognize how rotten the system we're in is, as if there wasn't already plenty of evidence to see that that's the case. But these, I think, just add to it. So we need more than just a revolution so that these kind of things don't happen in the future. But we need to really think about, like I say, even the geopolitical situation where we gather nuclear weapons, where we take space-time travel vehicles and we try to race against each other to develop those first. We work on bioweapons and we say it's just in case the other guys use it first. this is the kind of collective insanity that this points to. I'm getting on a bit of a rabbit trail here, but this is in the mix. This is part of what's going on here. It's just shocking when you really think about not just how much this is not making it into the mainstream yet, but when you think about just how deep and how far this goes, you wonder what it's going to take for that to happen.
Yeah, the knot feels so taut that to disentangle it is not going to be done without a great degree of friction and perhaps even damage. I think that is the main concern. Really giving the power back to the people, reclaiming our humanity essentially in the face of a far overreach of state power, and this is a glaring example of that, where the state has taken it upon itself to act on behalf of everyone else, not just in the U.S. but around the world, to keep this secret. So I put forward again as an optimist here that we have a tremendous opportunity at our feet now to turn a different page, and for the government to take the lead and try to do the right thing. And I'm heartened by people like David Grush, who this is a guy who's a young man. He's had a great career so far, but he's got a lot of life left ahead of him, and he walked away from that to try to expose this. I can't help but admire the kind of courage that it takes to do that, and it makes me believe that there are more people like him within our institutions, as broken as they are, who have the values and have the moral compass to do the right thing. And I would argue they are doing it. It is happening, and it will occur, whether we like it or not. The light will see the day. Interestingly, we had, as we talked about at the top of the show, we had a lot of other events happening this week, and chief among them was the National Press event with Stephen Greer, where we heard from several witnesses and whistleblowers, many of them who had been in the military and scientific community, come forward with some, incredibly bombastic claims. I don't think I've used bombastic in this podcast before. Well, there it is. Thank you. Appreciate it. There were quite a few claims there. One that stood out to me, particularly crazy sounding, but maybe totally plausible, was the Antarctic neutrino energy weapon that not only were we using this neutrino collector to look for neutrinos in the galaxy, but we're also using these things as a weapon to, I guess, take down craft that are near Earth, and I think he even hinted as well that that station might be used for some degree of interstellar communication of some kind. So a lot to kind of grapple with right there. But what stood out for you from the Stephen Greer piece?
Well, before we quickly go there, just to quickly back up for a second. So yeah, we went from the Grush revelations, and then just to draw this to a close with the Las Vegas incident, initially that got a lot of press, and that also got a lot of attention in UFO Twitter. But I think as time went on, it became more and more likely that it was a hoax of some sort. There are numerous reasons for that. Like you mentioned, there was an object noticed in the sky, a light that seemed to be falling to Earth. But of course, since then, we've had different groups establish that that was a meteorite of some sort. But of course, again, if you believe in all of the conspiracy theories, then you think, well, of course, NASA's going to say it's a meteorite. That's what NASA does. They cover these things up. This is the mess we're in, right? But what occurred to me was, okay, if we really want to check this kid's testimony, then we have technology today. We should be able to track the trajectory based on that footage to know where that would have fallen. Would it have fallen anywhere near his backyard? To me, that would set the story as truth or falsehood right away. Just do that. Simple thing you can do. And this is, again, where science can help us. But what we have, like you said, was this thing streaking across the sky, apparently falling to Earth. We had a kid making a 911 call talking about beings that were definitely not human. They're 8 feet tall, could be 10 feet tall, definitely not human. Kept saying that, right? So the meteorite footage, or whatever it was body cam footage from a police officer. And then you have police officers going to the scene and then getting caught up in the situation too. You can hear in their response that they're a bit nervous too. They don't really want to go in the backyard, and they sort of jokingly say, if it shows up again, you deal with it, don't call us. This is actually part of what happened. And of course, the kid also said he saw apparently a kind of like blurring that happened, some sort of cloaking device or something, just before the being disappeared with the craft, and that all was left was this perfect circle. But of course, one of the first things that cast doubt on these claims came when people did research and looked at Google Earth or something and saw that that circle had been there long before the reported incident. So that suddenly brings into question the testimony. So as time has gone on, it's more and more likely that it was basically just a hoax, and it was a combination of these coincidental events that put together made it seem a lot more credible than it was. Like you pointed out earlier, there was also this like rumble bang, like something crashing, and somebody's like door cam sort of like shaking in the neighborhood. And so when you look at that put together, it looks pretty compelling. But actually, when you parse it all out, it looks like a bunch of coincidental information and one kid who called 911 and kind of gave this incredible testimony. What was also interesting when I think back was I had some people saying, this kid's not lying. I mean, this sounds real, right? And then you had other people like James Fox saying, this kid does not sound credible to me when I listen to that. So that just shows you the subjective bias we have when we try to evaluate witnesses, which speaks to the fact that we do need to corroborate the accounts. And I think if we had just worked on trying to triangulate and establish where that thing would it have fallen anywhere near? My guess is no. My guess is that based on where it was falling and how fast it's traveling, it's probably gotten well beyond the neighborhood by that point. But that's the kind of thing that we could look into. But so the irony there, in the midst of what we're saying here, is this ended up most likely being a false story, and yet mainstream media covered it. So if they wanted to turn around and claim that, well, Grush's claims certainly sound interesting, but we just don't like to report on things that we can't say are really credible. And yet they published the Las Vegas incident, which very quickly with a bit of research and homework becomes pretty clear that it's most likely a hoax. So that doesn't really hold up what they're saying there. Again, I think it speaks to a combination of the implications are too deep, maybe the relationships with the DoD are too strong, and that subtle psychological, sociological resistance to just how deep-seated this fear is around this almost unconscious fear. Okay, enough about those two. Let's get on to, like you say, as if that wasn't enough already, we then had the situation with Greer coming forward and giving his testimony, his usual speech about what he believes about the phenomenon in terms of the beings and in terms of the government response. He also brought forward whistleblowers who you could say that were bringing forward testimony. Of course, we should be clear here. Number one, I think I found those people quite credible. I also want to point out, though, I think that, of course, he's going to bring forward witnesses that give testimony that supports his understanding of the entire thing, what he wants to suggest is going on here. So what's interesting is he talks about, Greer I'm talking about here, saying that basically ETs are benevolent. If ever you experience something negative, even like an abduction account kind of thing, that's my labs, that's the government doing bad things. We know that they, according to him, we've reverse engineered these vehicles, which I actually don't disagree with. I think we have done some of that. But that allows him to slot it into this neat category that whenever it's something negative, we can just trust that it's the government. Whenever it's something positive and glowing in love and light, then it's the ETs. So a couple things there. Number one, this is an open question. Are they ETs? Is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is based on our current understanding of space-time, even attainable? Is it even sensical once we have a larger understanding of the deeper structures of reality? That's an open question that's being asked right now. I've never really heard him address it on that level. There's kind of this is just assumption that that's what they are. But yeah, in terms of the witnesses themselves, that was very interesting. And the Antarctic situation, like you say, was quite a bombshell. Bombastic it was. I might even want to say Nathan was discombobulated by the nature of those revelations.
I was waiting for that.
But again, the witness sounded quite credible. And it does not surprise me that these things are going on. In fact, I think one thing both Nathan and I would testify to here is that the longer we've looked into the subject, the more it's bled into other topics that are somehow related. And it draws into more and more questions, so many things you assumed about the nature of reality, the nature of our governing structures, the nature of how much cutting edge science could be really kept under wraps that really is next generation to the point where it makes current generation look like horse and buggy kind of thing. So when he talks about these neutrino devices and a directed energy weapon in Antarctica that can also cause earthquakes, by the way, that also might be some sort of communication device, of course, the critics are going to say, absolutely, that's science fiction. In fact, I probably could point to the 3 novels that's based on. But this is what's in the mix, is that we end up with a situation where people don't know what to make of these things, because it does sometimes sound like science fiction. And yet, for people like you and I who really look into these things, and we hear about the credible witnesses like the Grushes of the world coming forward, you end up leaning, as uncomfortable as it is from a sort of total perspective in terms of worldview, you end up leaning towards the fact that's more likely to be the case than not. What was your takeaways from the Greer testimony and his witnesses?
Yeah, I mean, Greer, of course, is a lightning rod figure in the community, and he's got supporters and many detractors, arguably for good reason. I'm frustrated that these two events took place at the same time. I think that it became kind of easy, at least in the area of UFOs, for the Grush story to just sort of get buried under the weight of these other things taking place alongside it. Although I will say that Greer, at least from my perspective, I applaud what he's trying to do, but it doesn't seem to carry the same degree of weight that it would have carried back when he did the initial disclosure project. And of course, for a long time, Greer was really the figurehead of the movement and carrying the torch in the public arena for this topic. A lot of folks in who are interested in UFOs can tell you that one of their on ramps into the topic was through Stephen Greer, and either that was through CE5 or that was through one of his films. So we owe a debt of gratitude, I think, to Stephen Greer for those efforts. And clearly, he's got a lot of folks who are willing to step forward and confide in him and give him their trust in telling these stories. Now, a couple of things stood out to me about the conference itself. First of all, Stephen Greer looked pretty shaken up at the beginning of that conference. I've never seen him quite. I mean, he's an emotional guy, and I can relate to that. But he looked like he was under duress to a certain degree. So I don't really know what that was about. It was a little bit, concerning. The witnesses that he brought forward, again, I felt were, pretty compelling. But I wanted to know, and I think a couple of them may have said this, but it wasn't clear to me that all of them had. How many of them have brought their testimony to Arrow or tried to bring it to Arrow, which, by the way, still doesn't have a public-facing website on how you can do that. But how many of them have made that attempt or submitted their testimony to Arrow or to Congress? It would be good to know, the number of folks who have tried. And then, some of the claims are, my concern with it is some of the claims are so, larger than life. We had claims of basically human trafficking, with alien reproduction vehicles in the Indonesian jungle. We had, contractor careers destroyed just by being present and seeing a thing that they shouldn't have seen. A lot of, pretty out there sorts of stories. And my worry is that the sci-fi-esque nature of these incidents, really can make it super easy for folks who already don't want to give this any kind of second thought. They're going to be like, yeah, I mean, here we have more of that stuff. Here are the crazy stories, and look at these people who are talking. That they seem a little bit crazy. They seem like they're traumatized, and I don't want to be one of those. I don't want to be like them. I'd rather just kind of like keep on doing what I'm doing. And so that's the worry that I have with the effort from Stephen Greer. There's an earnestness that he brings to the topic, which is, I mean, great. I appreciate that. But at the same time, I feel like it's not as calculated in the impact that it would have as what we have seen from the likes of Christopher Mellon and Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, who have really tried to push this forward through the official channels and seed this in the right way in the public consciousness. where it can be accepted and palatable.
Absolutely. And I think because I know that he's a tricky figure who sets people off on both sides of the equation in ufology, I think I want to address the history a little bit here to give some context. I assume this is the case for you too, but I'll speak for myself. I think it's undoubtedly true that Stephen Greer has been a historic figure in this field. He gave invaluable evidence and really championed this cause in the 1990s when no one else was doing it. He really helped us establish the foundations of which we all stand upon. So I'm very thankful for him. Anything he does now does not take away from that ultimately. It's unfortunate, I think, that more recent actions by him have tarnished his legacy. I would say that because he does have an impressive legacy. And he did, I think, at one point in his life, put aside a career as an emergency doctor and pursued this full time and inspired many, many others to do so as well. I think it's important in these situations. I know this is a big thing that you and I believe, that it's important not to turn these people into demons or perfect heroes either. And so many people would like to demonize him and just say, he's just completely out for money and there's nothing else to him. I do not think it's that simple. He believes he's doing the right thing. I believe that. I also think that he is a troubled person who has, as some people know, had a challenging upbringing, and that impacts people. And we should be gracious because of that. We should not just want to demonize them, but we should have sympathy, empathy for things they've been through and how that might impact them. And those of us who've been lucky enough to have healthy childhoods, be thankful for the fact that we've had that. So while we can also, on the one hand, recognize that there's reasons why he is the way he is, we still can't deny the fact that he's turned into a very divisive figure who has gone so far as to attack people like Leslie Kean. I don't know anyone else who goes after Leslie Kean, because she has just been such a stalwart figure in terms of trying to be objective, trying to move forward this topic in a really careful, methodical way in our culture, has to maintain this fine balance between being respected in journalism, but also helping to move forward these causes she believes in, both in survival of death as well as the UFO phenomenon. So to go after someone like that doesn't make any sense to me, other than the fact that you are threatened by the fact that they are getting attention. He did the same thing with Luis Elizondo and people like that. So when people that support Greer 100% want to say there's a UFO cult that's against Greer now, it's not that simple. He has buried himself with his own actions, his own words. And that's partly why this did not get the traction it could have. He brought forward some great witness testimony. I'm saddened that it didn't get more traction because of the unfortunate recent history. Unfortunately, he is not capable of a degree of self-awareness to be aware of those things. And from all reports, including people that you and I know that were closely involved with Stephen Greer historically, he tends to ask people to move along when they dare to question any of his actions. So he's not really open to criticism. I think people that support Greer need to hear this. So this is where it is. It's a complex situation. He's not all good, not all bad. He has a great historical legacy. Unfortunately, recent actions have tarnished that to some degree and have not really helped the overall cause. And I think that's what we're most concerned with moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And, clearly there are folks that, find the work that he does to be incredibly gratifying. I met someone even recently that had downloaded his app and, is eager to try CE5. As you said, he has a very strong legacy, and we do owe him a debt of gratitude there. I can only hope that even though it may not be the avenue that you and I would choose or the methods that we would choose, that it serves as one additional means of moving this topic forward, because it does have reach. There are folks who, when they experience something, if they're going to, Google, who do I talk to? They're probably going to come across Stephen Greer and go to him first. And hopefully, he'll collate that and get it to somebody that will listen and it will move the needle in the conversation. I think overall, we've got a lot of different efforts at work here. And you and I know that unraveling this enigma really does require efforts on multiple fronts. What we want to avoid, though, is that kind of stumbling over each other. We want to make sure that we're not taking two steps backward, only one step forward. So I worry about that, and hopefully we won't have that happen here. We'll have some really productive things that will come from this particular conference, and I'd like to think that we will. Now, I want to kind of turn our attention, if you don't mind, at the end of the show here, to talk a little bit more about some of the reactions that we've seen, both in the community, the social media community, in the mainstream media, and particularly, I would like to talk a little bit about kind of the skeptical reactions to these events, and namely here, I'm talking about what we've heard from David Grush. There's been a wide, I think, reaction to these things. As you said, a lot of folks were, really primed before the debrief article hit the press. There'd been a lot of talk in recent weeks that something huge was coming, and there was something from the Washington Post, and everybody was on pins and needles, and it was going to change the conversation, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the article came and went. And while the conversation is changed, I think, it's not necessarily been this, the dawning of a new day. And everyone that you talk to, when you walk out into the world goes, have you heard about this UFO thing? That hasn't happened. And I think some folks may have had the expectation that it might. So we had, in a way, kind of like a hangover, a little bit of a sugar crash or something, after this took place. And we've seen a little bit of, frustration and maybe even some despondency, another word I haven't used on this show before, in the community. And so, I want to, kind of say that I understand that, I relate to that. It's been a roller coaster of a week, for those of us who have been tracking this very closely. But when it comes to the skeptics, and I want to talk about this, in particular, I have seen some of the most outlandish responses to David Grush from the skeptic community that, in my opinion, are now trending toward conspiracy theory of their own. That instead of saying, okay, we have a very credible witness here whose claims should be investigated, and we should support that investigation so that the truth will come to the light of day. And, I'm convicted that the truth will be there's no UFO thing at all. It's all, bogus. Instead of seeing that, we're seeing character assassination. We're seeing, ad hominem attack. We're seeing, ridiculous claims that he's just like he read a UFO magazine and then just like recycled those claims from UFO history and have said, I've seen it all. If that's happening with this guy, then we've got much bigger problems within the intelligence community of the United States. So, I think that we're seeing the debunkers and the skeptics in some ways kind of implode in real time as they search for ever increasingly crazy theories as to why this can't really be a thing. And the articles, in fact, that we did see from many of the mainstream outlets were along the same kinds of lines. As you pointed out, one of your tweets, that, they sort of end with this, you don't have to believe in this stuff because it's all hokum, and they don't do any work. They just sort of say, we've heard this before, and they play some X-Files music in the background, and you're not one of those people who believe this, right? So case closed. So it's getting increasingly difficult, I think, for the opposition of this topic to really have a footing. And, I'm curious if you think the same, and what's it going to be like for those folks who invested so much of themselves into, making it every effort they can that there isn't a there to this topic.
Well, I would say that our friend Kelly Chase made a point today that I saw that I think was right on, which is that, these people are suffering from their worldview being challenged to the nth degree. And they are going through crisis because of it, even if they're not fully conscious of this yet. So we can be impacted by things and be moved by things without being fully conscious of what we're doing. We can be experiencing cognitive dissonance before we are aware that we're experiencing cognitive dissonance. It has to reach a certain threshold for us to become aware of that. I think you're beginning to see signs of that with some of these characters, these skeptics, who, as you say, are now spinning tales that are so intricate and far-fetched that it sounds more like they are the ones trying to craft a conspiracy theory and form a cult than those that they accuse of doing the very thing. To suggest, first of all, that you think that, for instance, the videos that were released in 2017 were just misidentifications of prosaic vehicles and whatnot, and that you, in your basement, can ascertain that when the U.S. military, with all of its trillions of dollars and unique sensor systems and analysis systems, can't do that. Thank the Lord that you're there to do it for us, because we would be lost without you. Number one, you begin there, but then you end up saying all the Grush thing speaks to is that people tell lies, and because there's such a low level of discernment amongst the entire military, that something outlandish like this can get passed up the chain, and because it's passed up the chain, it's assumed to be truth. And again, we thank the Lord that you are there to help us realize that that's really what's going on. There's nothing to it. Again, if really the military, the government, was this susceptible to deceit, then how do any of us have a hope at all? As you say, these are ridiculous claims, and somehow they do it with a straight face. They make a big deal out of what seems like at first maybe a situation where perhaps the law firm representing David Grush separated themselves from him. But as you pointed out with your background in law, that's just because they had finished the duties that they were prescribed to do. And furthermore, we found out since then that the person who is directly representing him, someone with a lot of credibility, is actually going to full-time represent him now. So clearly this is not someone who wants to distance themselves from these claims. He believes so much in the claims and believes so much in the democratic importance of those claims coming to light that he's going to make it a full-time job to support Grush in his endeavors. This is where we are. Now, one thing I would like to touch on before we close today is the fine line between reporting things that are passed up the chain that are evidentiary. In other words, there is evidence for these things. And when even people who are whistleblowers who mean well veer into speculation, and that speculation gets taken as much as gospel truth as the other things that were passed on. So we have someone like David Grush, who admittedly said he has a physics background, and so he felt like he could wax philosophic in that interview with Ross, because this is what humans do, right? We try to make sense of things. And so he starts talking about maybe these are interdimensional. That could be the case. We don't know that they're space aliens. Now, on the one hand, I'm thankful that he widened the aperture and said this is not just a question of either it's prosaic or it's ETs from Alpha Centauri. It's not that simple. I'm glad that he opened that up. I think there was actually part of the interview that kind of got cut off or truncated, where he actually said maybe spacecraft is not the correct parlance, and that'll maybe will come out in the longer version of the interview. But it's interesting when we put together the Greer testimony and the Grush testimony, because I responded to someone on social media who talked about those two situations. So someone named Ben Lumen on Twitter said, quote, and this speaks to what you talked about before in terms of how Greer looked at the beginning of the conference. Greer looks like he had the living bleep scared out of him. He and Grush agree on the fundamentals: non-human intelligence, crash retrievals, cover-ups, criminal activity, etc. Where they differ is the interesting bit. Greer insists they're all friendly. Grush says they're not. So what's interesting there is that, number one, when he says Grush says they're not, this was one little piece of the interview where Ross sort of pressed him, and there was some discussion about perhaps there had been human casualties in the process of somehow engaging these non-human intelligences. Now, you and I, who've been familiar with the topic, recognize that there's more to it there. That's a bit of murky waters. There's been some suggestion that perhaps we engaged them. We went after them in an offensive manner, and perhaps there was some sort of crash or something that happened after the fact. So that's a human casualty. But was that really at the hands of the non-human intelligence? Can we infer from that they are malevolent? I think these are things we need to be very cautious about. I'm concerned when those kind of things get put out there because, again, based on our human psychology, we so quickly jump to threat. We hear that and we go, well, that sounds dangerous, right? Even before the interview, Ross had said in social media, what I've heard makes me scared. And people immediately jump to, oh, they're demonic, or there's something totally malevolent. They're out to invade us or destroy us, turn us into zombies. And yet later on, he actually said the part that scared him was actually that military groups had perhaps even gone as far as killing people to keep this secret. So these are things we need to be very careful about in terms of letting whistleblowers, let them speculate because they're human beings, but recognize when they're speculating. The same things happen with Luis Elizondo. We've talked about this before. He can talk about other kinds of humanity, and people jump to, oh, he knows something for sure because look at his position he had. But again, I think we need to be careful there. Sometimes what you want to do is open people's minds. You want to expand the conversation. It doesn't mean you're speaking to understood intel that speaks specifically to something. And this is something I just want to close with here in response to that thing that was said about Greer saying they're all good, Grush saying they're not. I said, quote, Greer's is a statement of faith for which he could not possibly have the requisite knowledge to state solidly. Grush's is an interpretation based on events that have admittedly often involved humans offensively engaging non-human intelligence where details are murky. Casualty does not equal malevolent non-human intelligence. So this is what I want to point to here. We can quickly leap to these things. And this is something that you and I have talked about many times on this show. We tend to either turn these people into heroes or we demonize them. We are very, very thankful for David Grush coming forward, but we need to do our due diligence now and recognize when he's speculating and when he's actually referring to valid intel that's been really obtained. For instance, one thing I found very interesting in his testimony was that he spoke to the degree of analysis, atomic level analysis that had been done on the metamaterials. And this is the first time we've heard about this, really, I think. This is one of the greatest revelations to me, was that they had come to a conclusion that there's no way. They were very, very convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that no other nation state developed this. This is not Chinese or Russian technology. It's too far outside of the box. It's things that we don't even understand how you would engineer it in that way. We don't even understand the emergent properties that it produces. This speaks, I think, to the biggest revelation in all of this, which is that the vehicles themselves that have been analyzed speak to this being fully non-prosaic, fully non-conventional. And if nothing else, I hope that moves the needle.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point to make, that we are doing a great deal of speculation, and you and I partake in that quite often as well. And we need to keep that front of mind as we hear these claims. I was really impressed with the level of nuance that he brought into the conversation. It wasn't as two-dimensional as you might expect it to be for someone that maybe saw some documents and just said, "Hey, we've got ETs and case closed here." He went out of his way to use particular words to try to add some additional context to what he was stating there. And I think that speaks to the degree of time, energy, and thought that he himself has put into this topic already. It's not something that he just sort of, grabbed off of a one page somewhere and said, okay, well, that's what it is. I mean, this is a guy who clearly he takes the skills that he has gained over the course of his career in analyzing intelligence and sussing out what might be true from all of that noise. I mean, that's what the guy, is skilled at doing. And clearly he did that here. He looked at these documents and he's extrapolating some conclusions based on what he has seen. But he's also, I think he was also pretty quick to say, this is sort of what I, what I think here, just based on what I've seen. So I really did appreciate that, and I'm frustrated with sort of the Stephen Greer kind of flattening of the narrative there. I think that's not particularly helpful, particularly those who might come to Greer and say, "I had a really bad experience." And you can only imagine his response being, "Well, you'll come to look at that very positively later. Like, it really wasn't bad." So I think we have to be fair and true to the experiences that we have here. I do worry that malevolent sort of intent or malevolent word is going to sort of carry a lot of weight as this goes forward, and I'm concerned that the instinctual human reaction to that is like, well, let's start getting some ammo and some guns and be ready for these. So, do you have a concern about that as well?
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting things when we look back at history, and I think I mentioned this to you before we went on the air, is that even when we do have press conferences that have been held or documents that have been uncovered in terms of different government agencies talking to each other, the vast majority of the time, what we actually see is this understanding that these others do not represent an imminent threat to humanity. That there's this recognition that they've been around, that they perhaps are surveilling us, but they don't pose a direct threat. And this is even said among some military circles who are very geared towards recognizing a threat. You could even say they're weighted towards seeing a threat even perhaps before there is one, because that's kind of their job. So this speaks to, I think, the fact that we've actually seen this over and over again, established that this is not a major threat. And this is why I wanted to bring in that nuance about the possibility that casualties, if they have happened, might be incidental and not actually intended. We also need to take in consideration experiencer data again, which I just want to point out again, this is not part of this conversation publicly. It should be. I don't think any of these journalists said, wait a second, we're hearing about craft, we're hearing about beings, we're hearing about dead pilots. Let's go talk to the people who claim they've actually spoken to these beings, people who have a remarkable degree of similarity, common ground in how they describe these beings, and there is a coherent message. And again, what I would point out is that even people, once they've overcome the ontological shock, get to the point, once they get past that initial trauma, that fight or flight response, they have an overwhelmingly positive attitude towards the interactions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be fascinating to watch this continue to unfold. We didn't even touch on the bit from his 1 hour testimony about the Vatican's involvement here. So I know that we're going to want to touch on that in a future episode, because there's a lot to dig into with that little piece of the puzzle. I think all pointing to the fact that, something that we talk about pretty much every show, that reality is a lot stranger than we think it is. That the things that we've been told about the world, about history, that they are far more complex than what we've been led to believe. And that, just being prepared for that eventuality, I think that's important to emphasize. It's important to keep our minds flexible and prepared for new information, and be willing and ready to assimilate new information as it comes our way, because no one has the corner on the story at this point. Facts are going to continue to emerge, new information is going to come to light, and we will have to assess that, analyze it, and group it with the other data sets that we have, both from the literature and from experiencer testimony, and on and on. We're going to have to continue to do the work to try to understand what this is all about. And I'm optimistic that we'll be putting more people to that task. The more and more that this topic does hit whatever media outlet it hits, with folks who have compelling testimony, the more folks who will see that, read it, digest it, and go, you know what, there is something there. And maybe I had an experience that was like that, and I can feel more comfortable coming forward and supporting this, and researching this, and encouraging others to do the same. And that's what is building the momentum, and will continue to do so.
Agreed. And I would say one thing that encourages me is that even though traditional media is slow to act on this, people who can think critically and are examining the evidence that's already been put forward, people like academics, there's more and more of those reaching out to me and to other people saying, how can I be involved? How can I get a hold of the raw data to begin to research this? Again, that's something with the John Mack Institute we're really encouraged about, and hope to see more of that happen. We want to see this dialogue, this interface between the experiencer testimony and academia. And I think what we'll find is that actually there's a lot of these outlier events that were considered outlier that are not nearly as rare as people think, that most of us know someone who's had an encounter of an unusual sort, whether it's a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, or some sort of psi event, or an encounter with a being that looks either like a typical gray alien, or perhaps even seeing a supposedly deceased relative. All of these things that supposedly cannot happen according to a physicalist model somehow are part of our reality. So far, they're being censored because they don't fit that. But hopefully, as time goes on and more of this evidence becomes clear, those who are willing to think critically about it, that begins not to just help us move towards how does this fit within our current model, but how is this information so persuasive and so predominant that actually it even begins to help us imagine and lean into other possibilities for reality. This is not just something you sort of cram into the suitcase that's already chock full. This is actually something like people like Nima Arkani Hamed are saying about reality. Space-time cannot be foundational. There's deeper structures. And I think eventually we will see a day where all of this data is allowed back in, that it can enter the public sphere, enter the academic sphere, and be looked at in an objective way. And I think that bodes well for our future.
Yes, here for that day. Well, we thank everyone for listening to this episode and for the words of encouragement that we receive on the comments. Your likes and subscribes are always welcome. And we look forward to the next episode where I'm sure we're going to have even wilder things to discuss. At least it seems we're on track for that. So I'm gonna plan for having another discombobulating conversation in the near future.
It will be bombastic, guaranteed.
Excellent. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.